Telling a story isn't about perfection, it's about communication. It's about our shared moments together. Hi, my name is Jeff Price, and I would like to welcome you to Intentional Musicianship, where we look at everything that goes on at center stage and the preparation behind the scenes needed to transform your performance into an unforgettable experience. I am here to encourage you, support you, and generally have a great time being united together with you through music. After a wonderful performing career as a storytelling musician around the globe, my joy is found empowering musicians to find the freedom to go beyond the music stand and the fourth wall of the concert stage to better engage with their audience members. This podcast isn't a classroom, it's a brainstorming session, and it is meant for musical performers of all ages. Together, we'll explore performance practice, stagecraft, the nuances of storytelling, and the strategies for genuine audience engagement. We're here to discover what truly makes a live performance resonate. So in this episode, I'm going to talk about musical expression. I'm going to use the terms compression versus contrast as we talk about making live music. In other words, is what you're doing on stage actually making it to the audience member? I'd like to start off with a quick story. And if you grew up in the 70s and the 80s in West Virginia, you know a guy named Barry Manilow. My mom loves him, my grandmother loved him, and I grew up listening to him all the time. Hey, I still follow him on Facebook. Now, his live performances were special, as he made each person in that audience feel like they were valued and loved. The song I like of his that is still the greatest in the history of the world is Copacabana. I love the rhythms. The story's interesting. I love the horns. It's just a great song. And I remember learning something about live music while listening to that song. I remember listening to Copacabana on the AM radio with my mom in the Plymouth Duster that she had, and we stopped at a shopping center right next to the local A&P, which was an old grocery store chain. Now, we had stopped to get some Superman ice cream, which was like a sherbet with many colors. And that was really a big deal. You know, I'm guessing 4 or 5. The problem was Copacabana was on the radio. But because I was so young, I didn't understand how the radio worked. I thought to myself that if I turned it off right before we went back to the chorus, I could come back to that piece exactly as I left it. Now, to my youthful sadness, I learned at that time that live music is in the moment and completely different than a recording. The ice cream was good, but I missed having Barry on the radio upon my return. And every time I play that song, which is around once a month when I go busking, it takes me back to when I was 4 or 5 years old dancing to those great old songs. So with this week's episode, I mentioned I'm going to talk about compression versus contrast and getting those things out to the audience. One thing I want to address are the lessons that you're learning on a weekly and daily basis with your primary musical instructors. They give you tidbits on technique and about how to enhance your performance. And I want to tell you a secret. When they encourage you to play softer or louder or shorter or longer or faster or slower, in part, they do this, because that's just the art of making music. But what they're really trying to get you to do to set you up for success is to get you to be versatile, to develop your skills, to adapt to a live music venue. And at the end, to tell an amazing story to your gathered audience. Now, let me explain to you sometimes what teachers will say in order to elicit a response from you, because they know you and they know your personality and how you're going to respond to it. As they talk to you, I recommend that you listen to their comments and take it in and think of what they're saying in context to where you'll be playing something and trying to figure out what the audience will actually be hearing as a result of what they said. Now, there's an old classic story that I heard about an old music edition. And in that music edition, for this classical concerto, it says, play like a Gregorian chant. Now, this concerto had nothing to do with a Gregorian chant. It doesn't resemble a Gregorian chant at all. However, when the editor of this music edition was a young student with his teacher, which was one of my old teachers, my teacher said, "Harvey, you ought to play this more like a chant." Now, my teacher, Fred Hemke, said this not because the composer said to play it that way, but because he was trying to get the young student to free himself from the constraints of the page and to sell the piece with greater musical insight. So when you think of things like that, I hope that maybe you might think of something special that a teacher might have said and reflect on what they were really trying to tell you. Now, in a recorded piece of music, it gets compressed, especially during that final mixing of the product. It's done in such a way that if you happen to be in an old car with an old stereo system, or if you have bad headphones, that piece will generally sound pretty good for everybody. Now, when this happens, there are many musical elements that are taken out of the mix. So when we play live, we have a real opportunity to stretch the music and to stretch our performances in such a way that we can positively color our music just like a painter. Because now you have this larger artistic palette, and now you have an even greater canvas to paint on. Now, compression to me might be like always using yellow as your color. Now, yellow is a great color. However, there are many variations of yellow that you could bring out as a great artist if you have a larger palette. And that's what you can do in live performance. So, in this live performance, your dedication, your craftsmanship, your deliberate work can really be shown off, and you can really connect with the audience. And this musical contrast that we have at our disposal and this larger artistic palette is one of the things we really have to utilize because it really makes live performance one of a kind. It's a special event. And that connection that the musician can have with the audience members can be enhanced if we look at the elements that make up music and we address how we can shade our performance. Now, when you play an event where you happen to have a sound technician, you might find yourself in another place where that sound and those shades might be compressed again. But even a great sound person can sometimes augment your performance to bring out your use of these incredible colors. The things that we're looking to address are the dynamics, the articulation, the extra tension you might bring when you're trying to tell a story. You might have to address how loud or how soft you realistically should play in order for the piece to actually come off effectively. In some ways, that's why I think our instructors really push us to the limits of our instrument, because then we can be on the lookout and see how our audience is responding. And then we can use our ears to see how the hall is responding. And because you might want to play one way differently in a concert stage, or you might have to play differently in an echoey church compared to a dry auditorium or a small parlor where you're sitting, just a couple feet from the audience member, but you're going to have this awesome capability to adapt. Now, music is funny because I had a teacher describe it to me this way, that when you're on stage playing live, you can really just, play louder, play softer, play faster, and play slower. And that's pretty much it. Now, if you just use those elements and you paint between the lines, you're going to have a lot of opportunity. And let me break down a couple things that you might want to look at within your music to make sure that your pieces are really selling. A funny thing to look at is something as simple as dynamics. If you're playing in a retirement community, your ability to play at extreme levels may not be needed for that one show. In fact, an extreme loud or an extreme soft might actually negatively impact your audience. So practicing with this adaptability and flexibility in mind should give you great confidence, as it shows that you have what it takes to be a true master of your instrument. And this ability to adapt will serve you really well in whatever circumstances you happen to find yourself. Now, sometimes you might not even know how loud or soft you are without some help. I remember listening to a sound check for a group, and as they performed, the group kept getting louder and louder and louder. And as I watched, I finally figured out what was happening. This concert band had an electric bass player, and they were playing some great Latin music. Now, because of the acoustics involved with the physics of music where his bass amp was, he couldn't hear himself as effectively. So in order to feel comfortable on that stage, and he didn't have any earpieces going in, he didn't have a monitoring system, he would just slightly, ever so slightly, turn up his volume. Consequently, as that sound actually did disperse, it made it to the other people on stage, and they couldn't hear themselves, so they got louder. And then after 2 or 3 minutes, everyone had raised their decibel level. Now, once the bass player understood that they couldn't raise the knob up to 11 like they wanted, the show went great. Now let's look at something like a caesura. It looks like a breath mark, and I love that one because it was made popular in a great 80s movie. I call it the greatest music movie of all time, Eddie and the Cruisers. And this actor, Tom Berenger, was talking to Michael Pere, who was the other lead actor. And he was talking about this caesura. And he was going through poetry. And he was going through the poetry with and without variations of a caesura. And he was explaining to the lead character what would happen when you added it and how the tension worked. And how, in order to make the beauty of the words come through, you had to add this caesura. And that's something I got to remember when I'm playing, because when you add space to your music in the right places, it really effectively sells your piece. And I think something that goes along with space and that caesura is something like a fermata, because in terms of musical tension or the direction in which you're going, you have that accelerando, you have that rubato, but you have a way to really lay into something. And I love that with something as simple as a fermata, you might suspend the music in time and then continue. You might take a breath in time, or you might continue without a breath. You might stop and rest on that moment, and then you might restart. There's so many options depending on the piece of music and the mood and the audience that you can communicate within that piece of music. In that same way, you have all these wonderful, colorful markings of how you can speed up and slow down a piece. You got to make sure that what you're doing in the music can be understood by the audience member. I think one thing that might be an opportunity to embrace is what effect you're really trying to achieve. Are you really trying to hit all the right notes on a chromatic run? Or is it really more important to just have a glissando where the effect is the landing spot? And that's the most important thing. I understand this gets a little weird within cultures and norms of being a musician. I understand you want to be as perfect as possible. But I remember after my hand injury, giving a couple master classes, and I was teaching a doctoral student on a piece, and I was trying to get them to engage the effect that the composer had written. And I was trying to say that this was the most important thing that they could do to sell their piece. Now, some of the other instructors watching, you could see it in their faces because they were very literal. And they were almost offended that I could bring up that the effect was more important than playing everything on that page. And I understood. But for this musician, I thought it was really important for them to realize what they were doing and how it would come off to that audience member. The notes were relative to what the effect really was supposed to happen. The moment that created is the cool thing. That written thing is just some notation. It was that effect that needed to be sold. So it's just something, within your experience, you can take it or leave it, but I just thought I'd bring that up. Now, the cool thing about music is that you really get to make a lot of decisions. Let's look at something like tempo. You get to decide how fast or how slow a piece is going to go at any given time. You can push it, you can relax it. By doing this, you might put a little bit more tension on the audience. You can make them relax. You can give them a little anxiety, and you can take them on this awesome journey with you. So it's important to use this within your playing to really sell what you're doing. Now, another thing is you might really have this really cool articulation passage, and you have to figure out how it's going to get out to the audience. Now, you might have this wonderfully separated dry staccato section. And when you're doing it, you might have to do it even more and exaggerate it with even more dynamic of your horn because of the location of what you're playing. One thing always striking is that when you're listening to these professional performers, is how great an ensemble can equally sound in a concert hall, a gymnasium, or my favorite, a cafetorium. Now, we always used to joke that we could sound the same in a gymnasium as we could on a concert stage. And the great thing that the setup and teardown on that gymnasium was a lot easier than that concert stage. Now, for these groups, I know it's because of those years of dedicated practice that they listened and learned together. They have versatility and they have this flexibility, and it's sort of ingrained in them. And as they've grown as musicians with their teachers, they went further and they continued learning, and they went on stage and they performed and they continued to adapt. The opportunity you have as you prepare your shows for center stage is to ensure that these techniques become methods of communication to ensure that within your storyboard or your moments for your show, that you effectively state what is needed to be said. That's it for today's episode. We hope that some of the topics and issues addressed today will be useful to you as you move forward in your musical journey. I want to take this opportunity to say thank you for joining us today. We know your time is precious, and we really appreciate that you have taken the time to listen to us today. Consequently, we'd like to hear from each and every one of you. You can reach out and connect with us at intentionalmusicianship.com. My hope is that we build a community where we can encourage one another through our mutual experiences performing live music. I look forward to connecting with each of you again on the next episode of Intentional Musicianship.